This morning, Sasha and I are working in a new field that we planted out in the first week of June, so a little over 2 months ago at a neighboring property. This is about a 3 to 5 minute walk from where we live, and our neighbor, our friend, was generous enough to give us access to this field this year. Still remains to be seen if we can grow here again in the future, but we're doing some management and work on it, specifically dealing with weeds and water holding through deep mulches. And so we thought we'd share notes on how things are evolving here. It might make sense to begin with an overview of what's actually happening here. You can see Sasha's working on the south end of this garden space. In total, this is probably about 1/8 of an acre. And our neighbor who let us, or is letting us work in here, he uses a tractor to do tillage. And so basically the way it worked is he tilled this. He was going to plant it to squash and gourds, but allowed us to grow in here. So we started with bare soil, opened up bare soil, and we've planted butternut squash all around the boundary to be our weed barrier between the garden space and the lawn around. And Sasha right now is trimming out some amaranth and using them as mulch to support those plants. We thought it would be a good opportunity to try growing some seed for our chickens. So this is all sunflower seed that actually is just from the standard bag of sunflower seed from the ag store. And we also planted out white millet, which are these rows in here, with the idea that maybe those could be for our hens as well. The corn in the middle is from a really diverse saved seed project we've been working on for a few years that makes really nice quality tortillas. So we're hoping to be able to have a whole lot of grain for us. So a lot of this, basically this whole field is around the idea of growing out winter storage crops in the form of butternut squash, grain for us and grain for our chickens, and then a little bit of nursery work. These are all honey locust babies in here, so we thought we'd experiment with that too. When we first planted this out in June, we had a whole lot of trouble because it was freshly tilled, and that has been the management strategy for this space for quite a long time. Our seedlings came up pretty nicely, but so did massive numbers of amaranth family and grasses and quickweed and all these amazing other valuable, useful plants that are really challenging. And so we clocked many hours early on, pulling weeds, leaving more bare soil, and trying to get our plants going. And part of the reason why we didn't just mulch right out of the gate is because we didn't know if this would be a space that we could work with in the future. And so somehow there was a reservation around investing the money in bringing hay bales out here. But then when we finally did it, the weeding went down to next to nothing. The plants took off like crazy. And maybe it's like $50 in hay to get that savings in the stress of having to weed, and the vitality of the plants is just going through the roof. Wish we had done that right at the very beginning, regardless of knowing if we could be here in the future. So we're now going headlong into deep mulch, and we will trim out weeds as we find them in between plants here and there, but for the most part we're simply pinning down weeds and then putting hay on top and moving this towards a permanent bed system that is permanently in deep mulch, Ruth Stout style. Our neighbor's plantings of ornamental gourds and different winter squash, he uses tillage and cultivation as his techniques, which have, I think in a good year works really well for him. You can see the rows of squash through there, or the gourds that are in there. But you can see the power of these. This is what our garden was looking like for a while. All valuable, useful plants, but they completely smother the desired crop. And I think because we've had such a dry year, each time cultivation happens and soil is exposed, the chenopodium, the amaranth family plants, are way faster, way more adapted to that dryness. And so they're able to take off. When we shifted away from pulling the weeds around these plants and in the walkways between, and instead simply taking them, stepping them over and putting mulch on top, things started to shift pretty quickly. The amount of labor goes down quite a bit, and more moisture is being held in for our plants. There's less competition for them, and certainly By no means is it a perfect silver bullet that the weeds die immediately. You can see here's a lamb's quarter that rebounded after being pinned down. We'll throw more mulch on top. We'll just keep doing that. You can see there's little banks of pads of mulch all throughout. And so from the last session, probably about 70 to 80% of the weeds are done in this walkway, but there's still some. We'll throw some hay on top, pin them down. Meanwhile, our crops will get stronger and stronger, cast more shade and more competition, and by the end of the season, we should be close to 0 weeds in here, and this is all a space that has had no watering in a decent drought year. We see a really distinct pattern happening as well. These butternut squash were having such a hard time when the soil was bare around them. See, this is the legacy of what it was looking like earlier on in the season. Still some weeds, no big deal, we can deal with them. As soon as we committed to pinning the weeds down with hay, mulching around these plants, the new growth, this is the tip leading growth, has greened up. So in other words, these plants have gotten much happier since we mulch, and they're actually starting to accelerate now. The beautiful part about this too, especially with winter squash, is you can see the drier, older, unhappy part and post-mulch. Flower, flower, flower. So they may still make a lot more squash. As this hay breaks down, if we actually get some rains, the squash will be able to root through the hay, down through the weeds that were there, and be able to accelerate even faster. So certainly a huge improvement in our plants, even within 3 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks of mulching.
Earlier in the season, when we were trying to promote the plants that we wanted, and so we were pulling a lot of amaranth and lamb's quarter that were growing, we collected them all, spent a lot of time and a lot of physical work loading up the truck to bring them home for the chickens to have greens, because their greens were pretty minimal, only to realize there's really a hierarchy for chickens and greens that they're interested in eating, and it seems that the wild growing amaranth and lamb's quarters are very low down. They didn't eat them at all. So now we're just letting them feed the plants that we'd like to harvest for the fall, instead of lugging them home for the chickens to ignore. These sunflowers, the seed we planted just came from a 50-pound sack of black oil sunflower seed from Agway. It's really one of my favorite things to do, is plant out our cabinets. If we don't have any beans to plant, to ransack the cabinets of beans that we would otherwise be cooking. But there's something special about putting in the ground and watching grow a seed that came from the grocery store that carries this additional value that somehow capitalism hasn't figured out how to ruin yet.
We'll share notes as the rest of the season unfolds. Hopefully we get a whole lot of sunflower and corn in particular, butternut squash for storage and for our hens and to share with friends and family. The millet feels like almost certainly will be the domain of the wild birds, and that's fine for now. Maybe we get some. We'll keep mulching, keep building the soil, moving the space towards permanent beds under deep, deep cover with zero tillage, and share notes on how that works. It seems important when making the juxtaposition to our neighbor's method of planting and how weedy it is in here at this point in the year, that in fairness, he has also not spent much time at all on this project. He came in with the tractor group, planted, cultivated a few times, and will probably still get a lot of squash out of the deal, even though it's so weedy. So I'm not trying to be disparaging about his methods in any way at all. We've clocked way more hours than him. But what's nice is that this sort of pattern, which is so loaded with weed seeds, is being broken by taking those weed plants, those wonderful, amazing, abundant, nourishing weed plants, and feeding them back into the soil and covering the soil so that there's no incentive, no need for the soil to erupt with more weeds in the future years. So as long as we keep this mulch on here, we maintain the permanent beds and permanent pathways, then we can always just pull the mulch slightly aside next spring, plant out what we want, and put the mulch back and add more mulch as a measure. The beautiful part too is that this method, the sunflower stalks, their leaves, the corn stalks, their root systems, all of that adds to the bulking and the building and the covering of the soil. So it should aggregate and improve over time. Fingers crossed our lovely neighbor lets us grow in here next year and we can keep building what we've started. But we're pretty amazed. Annuals are stunning sometimes, that this is just over 60 days and here we are already. Let's see how the rest of the season plays out and we'll share notes as we go. Thanks so much for watching.